Greetings. We recently explored how economic and political new thinking we labeled as classical liberalism led to liberating innovation. This week we will discuss how these new ideas associate to popular rule, also known as popular sovereignty, as well as the natural rights to liberty, property, and equality contributed to a series of late 18th century political revolutions we term the Atlantic Revolutions. Before we review the Atlantic Revolutions, note that the language of natural political and economic rights associated to classical liberalism derived from a revolution in scientific thinking that begins in the 17th century is known as the Scientific Revolution. The towering giant of the scientific revolution was Isaac Newton, an Englishman who died in 1726, a national hero. His achievements were many, but the crowning one was his 1687, 1 year before the Glorious Revolution, book, The Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy, truly the founding text of modern astrophysics. In it, Newton brought together the previous findings of Copernicus, Kepler, Galilei, added new observations, and new mathematical and geometrical modeling to produce the most influential universal law of physics to date, the universal law of gravitation, as well as other precisely calculated laws of motion. In it, he shattered any remaining doubt that universal natural laws governed how nature functioned. In the law of universal gravitation, he proved through mathematics and geometry that the same law dictated the falling of an apple to the ground as that which governed the orbit of the moon around the earth, or the orbit of the earth around the sun. With Newton's universal law of gravitation, the old artificial separation between the spheres of heaven and earth was gone forever. The planets, the sun, the moon, earth, and all objects on earth were now seen as obeying the same predictable natural laws established at the beginning of time by God. The notion so brilliantly established by Isaac Newton in 1687 that nature has its measurable and predictable and therefore provable natural laws led thinkers in other areas of knowledge to question whether politics, society, economics, human nature itself obeyed natural laws too. One of the first and most influential of such thinkers we have already encountered, John Locke, the theoretician of the Glorious Revolution. He, we saw, claimed that men are born with natural rights to equality and to freedom, and that they should only consent to limitations to their natural rights through consent, in other words, through the establishment of an elected parliament. Note that the universalism of his language of rights echoed and was inspired by the universalism of the language of natural laws of the scientific revolution. Hundreds of other thinkers other than John Locke also used the new language of natural laws and natural rights to create a new science of man. Collectively, we term this European and Atlantic networks of thinkers and their products, whether they be books or recommendations made to rulers, the Enlightenment. As a movement of ideas, it drew its origins in the late 17th century but peaked in the 18th century. Its main ideas were ones which would continue to inform modern thinking in our own time. An optimistic belief in progress, first of all, a very modern one which replaced the pre-modern belief that the best times of humanity lay behind in the past or in the afterlife, not ahead in the real existing world. At the core of the belief in progress was the faith in reason, the belief that rationality would eventually trump superstition and error and result in a better, more just society for all. Enlightenment thinkers generally did not reject religion per se, but they believed religious tolerance was essential and that religion and politics should best be kept separate. The Enlightenment was an international intellectual phenomenon, but it had different centers on either sides of the Atlantic Ocean. The Baron de Montesquieu was a typical figure of the Enlightenment. An aristocrat, he embraced the new thinking, though remained attached to the notion that social privilege was an essential building block of society. He is famous for having formulated the theory of the division of powers in government between executive, legislative, and judicial branches. But his views on freedom and equality were not expansive. As a member of the privileged classes, he believed that each class in society has its place. Further, he was no admirer of democracy, but like John Locke, preferred constitutional monarchy of the kind that existed in England, and he hoped that it would soon be introduced into his own country, France, where absolutism still held throughout most of the 18th century. Montesquieu was, in other words, a conservative Enlightenment thinker, illustrating how the ideas of classical liberalism in the minds of its upper-class supporters were not associated to radical social and economic change. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, a citizen of Switzerland, represents a different strain of Enlightenment thought that is in some ways at odds with classical liberalism. Rousseau believed in a more expansive application of the right to equality than did Locke or Montesquieu. At the heart of Rousseau egalitarianism was his antipathy for private wealth and his belief that property was at the basis of society's injustices and inequalities. Rousseau's political thought would exert great influence during the French Revolution and especially its radical phase, as well as into the 19th and 20th centuries. His hostility to excessive corrupting wealth, as well as his notion that the general will of the majority of a nation's people is more important than trumps the rights of individuals or minority groups, would be at the basis of future radical new thinking such as direct democracy, socialism, communism, and nationalism. Certain critics have even called Rousseau the father of 20th century totalitarianism, arguing that his claim that the majority is always right and that the minority always wrong would be used to justify the total rule of 20th century totalitarian states, such as that of the communist Soviet Union or of the Nazi fascist states. Throughout most of the century, Enlightenment ideas were regarded with suspicion by rulers and often repressed. Enlightenment thinkers had often to resort to exile to avoid prosecution by repressive authorities or had to publish their books anonymously in foreign countries more open to new ideas, such as the Netherlands or Great Britain. On the other hand, absolutist rulers, such as, for example, the Frederick II of Prussia, occasionally consulted with Enlightenment thinkers too, provided the application of their ideas did not threaten their power. Throughout continental Europe, absolutism remained the norm for most of the 18th century. But the immobility and conservatism of absolutist political systems came to an end over the last quarter of the 18th century in a series of interrelated political revolutions that happened on either side of the Atlantic and are known as the Atlantic Revolutions. In the course of the Atlantic Revolutions, what had been quite abstract ideas of liberty, equality, and popular sovereignty would, for the first time since the English Revolution of 1688, help give birth to new political systems. The four great convulsions most closely associated to the Atlantic Revolutions are the American Revolution of 1776 to 1783, the French Revolution of 1789 to 1799, the Haitian Revolution of 1791 to 1803, and the various Spanish-American revolutions and wars of independence of the first quarter of the 19th century. In this class, we will focus especially on the French and Haitian revolutions in Europe and the Caribbean. Our objective will be to outline how Enlightenment ideas of natural rights to popular sovereignty, liberty, and equality influenced, helped produce, but also were in turn shaped by political events. We will also discuss how the various revolutions were interconnected with one another and also the product of international wars between the great imperial powers. The Atlantic Revolution was the American Revolution, which breaks out in 1775 when British settlers in the 13 East Coast colonies of Great Britain rebelled to their mother country. They rebelled for a number of economic and political reasons, brandishing the slogan of "No taxation without representation," in response to recent decisions of the British imperial authorities to impose taxes for the first time on their colonial subjects. British settlers in the 13 East Coast colonies, in particular, had grown accustomed to virtually independent self-rule through local representative assemblies, and they considered that the London Parliament did not truly represent them, especially since no American-born representatives voted or sat as a representative overseas in London. The revolutionary slogan of "No taxation without representation" and the accompanying notion of a natural right to liberty and equality and private property derived directly from the ideas of John Locke, though the latter would doubtless have been horrified by the uses now being made of his ideas. The appropriation by American rebels of classical liberal ideas would typify the unintended consequences of Locke's new thinking. Initially, things did not go well for the American revolutionaries. Luckily for them, however, in 1778, the traditional enemy of the English, the French monarchy, decided to back the American independence movement with military and other help, ultimately leading to the triumph of the American Revolution by 1783, which produced the world's first large democratic republic, the United States of America. American independence made a huge impression on European opinion on account of the apparently concrete realization for the first time of Enlightenment ideas: popular sovereignty, democracy, and liberty. In a continental Europe still largely characterized by absolutism, the young American republic seemed to announce a future profoundly different from the past, the opening chapter of a new age of humanity, the so-called Age of Reason, and, not least, it would help inspire the next revolution of 1789 in France. There is also a concrete financial way that the American Revolution led to the later French Revolution. The French monarchy had spent a fortune supporting the American rebels, getting deeply into debt. By 1787, the French state and monarchy were bankrupt and in desperate need of financial relief. This desperation led French King Louis XVI the following year to convene a General Assembly of his people's representatives known as the General Estates, setting off an unexpected string of events that would lead to the French Revolution of 1789. Surveying the events of the French Revolution, it's important to explain how pre-revolutionary absolutist France functioned. French society was then divided into three so-called estates. The first estate included the members of the Catholic clergy, while the second estate included the landed nobility or aristocracy. In effect, members of the first and second estate tended to be from the same social class, the nobility or aristocracy. The third estate included all other French subjects and the overwhelming majority of the French population, over 90%. As French pre-revolutionary society was still heavily agrarian, most of these were peasants, and most peasants were poor and landless, cultivating land leased from the landed nobility in exchange for food and services, as in feudal times. The third estate also included non-aristocratic merchants, artisans, and other professionals, usually concentrated in urban centers. The first and second estates were not only privileged on account of their inherited wealth and titles, but also due to being exempt from taxation, unlike the third estate. The tax-exempt status of the first and second estates, added to their other numerous privileges, was the occasion, you might well imagine, of considerable resentment among the 90% of the population lumped into the third estate. Inequality was the foundation of French society, like other agrarian civilizations. Now, how does this all fit into our account of the French Revolution? Well, while the French monarchy was absolutist, its kings had very occasionally resorted to consulting their people in what was known as the Estates Generals, or Assembly of the Estates. The last time a French king had done so had been a long time ago, in 1614. But now in 1787, as mentioned earlier, faced with dire financial disaster and the need to raise new taxes, King Louis XVI reluctantly convened the Estates General to his capital Versailles, right outside Paris, in May of 1789. This was a fateful decision that would lead to a revolution. Representatives of the three estates thus gathered in the so-called Estates General Assembly in Versailles in May 1789 to debate royal policies, including the newly proposed taxes. Discontent was rife among all participants of all social classes. The first and second estates were in near revolt against the monarchy due to King Louis XVI's intention to tax them for the first time. On the other hand, the third estate, encompassing commoners, meaning non-aristocrats, supported the proposed imposition of new taxes on their social superiors, but were deeply anxious on account of how traditional voting might proceed. Traditionally, each estate collectively received one vote when debating a new law or tax. And in addition, the three estates were required to meet in separate chambers, signaling the distinct and unequal status of the third estate. This traditional procedure, virtually guaranteeing that the first and second estates would vote against paying a new tax, which would leave, as usual, the third estate, or 90% of less privileged portion of the population forced to continue to pay all taxes. This prospect of having to continue to pay taxes led to the revolt of the third estate. The first revolutionary act was taken by the third estate on June 10, when third estate representatives declared that the traditional voting procedures were illegitimate, and they invited all members, including of the other estates, to join them in a single representative body. At this stage, a few nobles and high clergy joined the third estate. On June 17, a further revolutionary step was taken when the convening third estate renamed its gathering the National Assembly. The very consequential implication was that its members were the sole legitimate representatives of the French nation. Voting, it was now decreed, would now be implemented on the basis of one single vote per representative, regardless of social class. This tipped the balance in favor of non-nobles and non-high clergy, as a number of the former had joined the cause of the revolution and the third estate had greater numbers. Even as increasing numbers of representatives of the nobility and high clergy joined the National Assembly, though, Louis XVI resisted these changes, at one point threatening military intervention. Such threats led in turn to a popular insurrection in Paris, most famously associated to the fall of the Bastille on July 14, 1789, still the national feast of the French Republic. Bowing to popular will now, Louis XVI in the end accepted a fait accompli. Presently was inaugurated the first phase of the French Revolution, the establishment of a constitutional monarchy with Louis XVI at its head. A constitutional monarchy has already existed in Great Britain, but had been absent everywhere else, virtually in continental Europe. A very reluctant constitutionalist, Louis XVI was forced to renounce absolutism and to accept the authority of National Assembly, France's version of Great Britain's parliament. During this first phase of the French Revolution, lasting 2 years from June 1789 to 1791, a number of far-reaching reforms were put in place. On August 4, feudal dues were abolished, in effect terminating medieval feudalism and instating, theoretically, a nation of politically equal citizens. The Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen on August 26 followed, a document partly inspired by the U.S. Declaration of Independence, but going further in its assertion of the rights and duties of every French citizen. In November, another set of privileges of pre-revolutionary France was dismantled. The property of the Catholic Church was confiscated and turned over to the nation. While this act enriched the new revolutionary state, however, it also alienated the Church and its supporters, setting them against the revolution in a pattern with huge historical consequences. The first, more moderate phase of the French Revolution, characterized by constitutional monarchy, ended by 1792. That year, war erupted between revolutionary France and its neighbors, who had grown increasingly alarmed as Louis XVI was progressively stripped of his power. Surprisingly, French revolutionary armies were able to expel the invading forces of absolutist foreign rulers and even to counterattack, occupying parts of the Austrian Low Countries in the north and German-speaking lands east of the French border. Everywhere French revolutionary troops went in Europe henceforth, the promised fraternity and liberty and the abolition of feudalism spreading the ideas of the French Revolution across the continent. By early 1793, Louis XVI had been executed, the monarchy abolished, and the continent's first democratic republic proclaimed. Over the course of this radical phase of the French Revolution, voting rights would be extended to all male voters and slavery abolished in the French colonies, a colossal achievement. But grave violations of rights also occurred during this phase, when real or perceived enemies of the revolution were executed by the thousands, many by being beheaded by the guillotine, the so-called revolutionary equalizer, as dubbed by its supporters. Hence, this radical phase of the revolution would earn a mixed reputation as marking both extreme application of notions of equality inspired by Rousseau's thinking, but also the violent repression of the rights of individuals and minority groups opposed to the revolution. By 1795, the radical phase of the revolution, or reign of terror as labeled by its adversaries, had run its course. A return to moderate policies under the leadership of the so-called Directory, a consortium of leaders beholden to republican institutions, went forth. But conflict with foreign powers continued, and under the able leadership of Revolutionary General Napoleon Bonaparte, French conquest also ensued, exporting wherever they went the ideas and institutions of the French Revolution, which by now continued to spread throughout Europe. Finally, in late 1799, that same general, Napoleon, overthrew the Directory, formally ended the revolution, and established himself as France's new sole ruler. But while he rolled back many of the achievements of the revolution and proclaimed himself Emperor of the French in 1804 by ending the First Republic and restoring slavery in the French colonies, he also preserved and extended other revolutionary accomplishments. His civil code of the French established the legal rights of the citizenry, the abolition of feudalism was confirmed, as was the modernization of the French state, and even a small measure of constitutional restraint on his power was preserved. We must now turn to the revolution in one of France's key and rich Caribbean colonies, Saint-Domingue. This is, of course, the Haitian Revolution. And we will discuss how Enlightenment ideas of equality and liberty played out there. We noted earlier how during the second radical phase of the French Revolution in 1789, slavery had been abolished by the revolutionary government. That act had actually been a response to events far afield in the French colony of Saint-Domingue. On the eve of the French Revolution, Saint-Domingue was the most profitable of France's colonies. Its economy was characteristic of the extractive practices of war capitalism. Sugarcane was harvested by African slaves under extremely brutal conditions. The brown gold, as it was sometimes called, was then exported to the increasingly sugar-addicted motherland at immense profits. Most of those profits accrued to a small class of French plantation owners, many of whom resided in the colony, living a life of great luxury and privilege. Alongside the rich whites also resided white folk of lower incomes. About 500,000 African slaves were in place, also dwarfing in number the some 40,000 white French citizens. And in addition to the enslaved Africans and free whites, there were about 30,000 free people of color, often of mixed race, who also resided on the island. Their incomes varied. Some, like the future revolutionary hero Toussaint Louverture, had accumulated a degree of wealth and social standing and owned slaves of their own. Social and racial tensions were widespread in Saint-Domingue. Poor whites envied the rich plantation owners and resented upwardly mobile free people of color. Free people of color, on the other hand, clamored for respect and opportunity. And of course, the African slaves, representing about 90% of the population, struggled to survive and seethed with desperate rage. Enter the outbreak of the French Revolution and its August 1789 Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. Each of the four social groups in the island of Saint-Domingue seized upon the dramatic events in Paris to push for their own agenda. Each interpreted differently the noble words of liberty and equality for all. First, the rich white planters pressed for economic reforms and a rejection of mercantilism, under which terms they could only sell their sugar to France. They wanted to make even more money and therefore favored freer trade. Second, the poor whites clamored for more economic opportunities. Third, free people of color demanded the same political and civil rights afforded to all whites. And number four, African slaves, despite strenuous attempts on the part of the other three social groups to keep revolutionary news from them, learned about events through word of mouth and interpreted revolutionary proclamation of human rights in Paris on face value. The end of slavery and the right to cultivate their own land for their own benefit. In other words, equality and liberty, as we conceive nowadays of the term, were born in the minds of these African slaves. An uneasy couple of years followed, during which tensions between groups mounted on the island. When in spring 1791 the National Assembly decided to award full French citizenship to free people of color with property and two free parents, civil war erupted across the island, initially pitting against each other two groups, poor whites versus free people of color. Then, in August 1791, a major slave insurrection began. Demands among slaves were varied, ranging from reforms to the slave system to its complete abolition, or even to the expulsion of all whites from the island. The slaves, despite their dispersion, managed to create in short order a powerful army of some 10 to 20,000 soldiers. Chaos erupted across the island as plantation burned. The French revolutionary government at this stage attempted to repress the slave rebellion, but the latter found an able leader in Toussaint Louverture, a former slave and owner, ironically, of slave plantations himself. 1793 was also the year revolutionary France went to war with two more European powers, Spain and Great Britain, in response to the execution of King Louis XVI earlier that year. Spain's colony of Santo Domingo, which occupied the eastern half of the same island of Hispaniola, presently provided a base for Spanish military interventions into the French colony. This resulted with an ad hoc alliance between Louverture and the Spanish to fight the French. The British also got involved, not through direct aid to the rebel slave army, but by blockading the French colony and weakening therefore the white planter class. At this point, the plot thickened further. Facing possible loss of their colony due to the combined slave rebellion and Spanish and British interventions, the French revolutionary government, which, remember, had entered a radical phase in late 1792, decided to officially abolish slavery in the French colonies in 1794, recognizing its de facto abolition on the ground in Saint-Domingue. This decision, a combination of revolutionary idealism and hard-nosed practical considerations, achieved its purpose. Louverture, learning now that France had abolished slavery, immediately jumped ship, joined the French, and then, nominated as the highest-ranking French officer on the island, took back the colony for France and expelled the invading Spanish forces and British ones too by 1798. After 1795 and the end of the radical phase of the revolution in France, Louverture grew anxious that now that Saint-Domingue was back in French hands, it was increasingly imaginable that conservatives and reactionaries might want to re-establish slavery on the island. And it was in this context that he wrote the text assigned to you, in which he reflects on his past revolutionary achievements. In the event, Louverture's fears proved justified. As discussed earlier in 1799, Napoleon Bonaparte took power, ending the French Revolution, and then later reinstating slavery in the French colonies. Napoleon's plan had been to rebuild French economic power by expanding the sugar slave plantation economy in Saint-Domingue and in French territories of Louisiana, then part of the French Empire. But while Napoleon managed to capture Louverture and bring him to France captive, where he would die, sadly, in jail in 1803, his dream of reimposing slavery in Saint-Domingue and rebuilding a French-American empire would fail. In 1803, Toussaint Louverture's successor, Jean-Jacques Dessalines, leading a black army of former slaves and people of color, soundly defeated Napoleon's invading army, which was already weakened by an epidemic of typhoid and other tropical diseases. In 1804, Dessalines proclaimed the independence of Haiti, the first free black republic, and the first time in human history a slave rebellion produced a durable state. The aftermath of the Haitian Revolution, though, had mixed outcomes for Haitians. On the one hand, in an amazing achievement, slavery had been abolished for good. On the other hand, subsequent rulers of Haiti and their elite supporters continued to exploit Haitian sugarcane workers, and who were now paid low wages but remained mired in desperate poverty. Further, Haiti did not develop into a democracy, not least because it was subjected to unrelenting boycott by the French and the Americans, who did not wish to see a former slave economy succeed. Now, what general conclusions can we draw from the experience of the Atlantic revolutions? On the one hand, the American, French, and Haitian revolutions were unquestionably inspired by classical liberal ideas of equality and liberty, popular sovereignty, ideas ultimately derived from John Locke. And in this qualified sense, we witness here the birth of human rights too, or the notion that all humans have fundamental rights. On the other hand, these notions of equality and liberty were ultimately applied very unevenly and very slowly. The American Revolution maintained slavery in the South, which would lead to a civil war later in the 19th century, and the continued pathologies the United States still suffers to this very day. The French Revolution would cede after 1799 to a tyranny under Napoleon, and only truly emerge as a modern democracy after 1871, almost a century later. And French women would only get the right to vote in 1945. The Haitian Revolution, most radical in its application of rights to enslaved populations, would, however, fail to produce a democratic system or a prosperous economy for all, a fate which unfortunately continues to haunt the island nation. So really, how you judge these revolutions is truly a question of whether you think the glass is half full or half empty. Perhaps their most important legacy would be as an inspiration for the future struggles of oppressed and underprivileged peoples to this day, and for the now widely accepted, though not yet realized, notion that all humans have fundamental rights.